The cold that settles over the Wyoming backcountry in the deep weeks of January is not the kind of cold that merely chills. It is the kind that enters a man slowly, patiently, the way a debt collector enters a house quietly without apology and with no intention of leaving until it has taken everything it came for. Jesse Harlan had lived inside that cold for a long time. Not the cold of the weather, though that was real enough. The cold he had learned to carry was something older and quieter. It lived in the spaces between words never spoken, in the empty chair, across a table that had never once held another person, in the sound of wind against cabin walls that no human voice had ever softened. He had built that silence himself, board by board, season by season, until it fit around him like a second skin, until it stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like weather, simply the condition of his days, as unremarkable as the altitude or the angle of the afternoon light. He was 38 years old, and he looked like a man who had been asked too much of by the land and not enough of by life. His ranch sat 200 acres deep in the northern stretch of Garfield County, 5 miles from the nearest settlement, 10 miles from anything resembling civilization. The cabin was low and solid, built from split logs and riverstone, the kind of structure that would outlast the man inside it. The barn leaned slightly to the west from a windstorm 3 winters back that Jesse had never quite gotten around to correcting. The fence lines ran straight and true because Jesse walked every inch of them twice each season, replacing posts, tightening wire, refusing to let anything fall apart that he could hold together with his own 2 hands. The livestock knew his voice better than any human ever had. He had not always been this way. There was a version of Jesse Harlan that existed only in memory now, a younger man, 23 years old, who had come back from checking the eastern fence line on a dry August evening to find the sky above his family's land turn the color of a wound. The barn had caught first. His father had gone in to save the horses. His mother had gone in after his father. By the time Jesse reached the property line, both structures were consumed, and the 2 people who had built everything he had ever known were gone. The neighbors came the next morning. They brought food and expressions of sorrow and words that were meant to comfort but landed like stones. They patted his shoulder and said what people say when they do not know what else to say, which is to say they said very little of use. And then one by one they returned to their own lives and their own land and their own concerns. When Jesse needed hands to work the fields through that first summer, the neighbors were busy. When he needed help rebuilding the barn, the neighbors were occupied. When he needed a loan to buy seed for the following spring, the neighbors had nothing to spare. And somewhere around the second winter, when the ranch should have folded and everyone expected it to fold, Jesse began to understand that certain people in that county were not hoping for his recovery. They were waiting for his collapse. There were men who had quietly priced his land and quietly calculated what they might pay if desperation drove him to sell. He did not sell. He worked himself to a place beyond exhaustion and kept going. He lost cattle in a bad winter and bought fewer the following spring and worked harder to compensate for the smaller numbers. He fixed the fence lines by hand in the dark sometimes when the days were not long enough to hold everything that needed doing. He learned to do without things he had once considered necessary: conversation, laughter, the particular warmth of knowing someone was waiting for him to come home. He learned to be enough for himself because there was no one else. And so by the morning of the 14th of January, Jesse Harlan had become a man so deeply accustomed to solitude that it no longer felt like deprivation. It felt like air, necessary, invisible, simply the substance of his days. He rode out before dawn that morning to check the northern fence line, the stretch of wire and post that marked the boundary between his land and the Caldwell property. The Caldwells were old money in Garfield County, the kind of family whose name appeared on church pews and courthouse records and the lips of men who wanted something from them. Jesse had no business with the Caldwells and preferred it that way. The northern fence was simply the end of what was his. The horse moved steadily through the pre-dawn dark breath, clouding in the frozen air. The temperature had dropped again overnight, the kind of deep cold that turned the ground iron hard and made every sound carry farther than it should. Jesse could hear the creak of frozen pine branches 200 yards away. He could hear his own heartbeat. He was checking the third post from the tree line when he heard something else. He stopped the horse. The sound was faint, carried on the wind from the east from somewhere near the Caldwell boundary. He told himself it was a coyote. The acoustics of frozen air played tricks on a man's ears. He told himself to keep moving. The sound came again, and then again slightly different, slightly higher, slightly more urgent. Two sounds now layered over each other, rising and falling together in a pattern that had no analog in the animal kingdom. Jesse had spent years in country where the only voices were creatures of the wild, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had learned to trust what his body understood before his mind caught up, that what he was hearing is not any animal he had ever hunted or herded. He urged the horse forward. The trees thinned as he approached the boundary line, and the gray light of the approaching dawn was just enough to make shapes out of shadows. The fence line came into view, wires strung between posts, most of them solid and straight. And then at the third post from the left, something that did not belong. Jesse dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He saw the post before he saw her fully. Something had been cut into the wood just above where the ropes were knotted, not scratched in haste, but worked deliberately with the patience of a man making a statement he intended to last. 4 words carved deep and clean into the grain. He read them in the gray dawn light and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Women die here alone. He looked at those words for the space of one breath. Then he pulled his knife and moved to the woman slumped against the post. She was slumped against it in a way that made his stomach turn before he understood why the angle was wrong, the posture of a body that had lost its ability to hold itself upright. Her wrists were bound to the wood, not with careless knots, but with tight, deliberate wraps of rope that had cut through the skin in several places, leaving dark stains against the pale of her wrists that he understood to be blood, even in the low light. Her head hung forward, dark hair matted across her face, and her dress wholly insufficient for the temperature. A house dress meant for indoor work and not for the outdoors in January was soaked through with melted snow and something darker along the hem. At her feet, wrapped in what had been a single shawl torn raggedly in half, were 2 small bundles. They were the source of the sound. Jesse crossed the distance between himself and that fence post in 3 strides and cut the ropes from her wrists before he had fully registered the decision to do so. She collapsed forward, and he caught her. She weighed almost nothing. Her skin, when the back of his hand brushed her cheek, was the temperature of the post she had been tied to. Her lips were faintly blue. Her breathing when he pressed his ear close was shallow and uneven, the breathing of a body that was still fighting, but had been fighting for a very long time and was running low on the will to continue. Her eyes opened. They were gray, pale, unfocused, full of something that took him a moment to identify because he had not seen it directed at himself in a long time. Terror, pure and uncomplicated. The terror of a person who had already experienced the worst and was bracing for more. "Don't," she whispered. The word was barely sound, more breath than voice. "Don't take them." Jesse lowered her carefully to the ground, taking her weight with both arms and setting her down as gently as the frozen earth allowed. "I'm not taking anything," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the way a door sounds when you open it after a long time, functional but not smooth. "I'm helping." He did not know if she heard him. Her eyes drifted closed again. He turned to the children. He had never held an infant in his life, had never had occasion to. They screamed at him with the complete and furious abandon of newborns who understood nothing except cold and hunger and the absence of comfort. Their faces were red and scrunched, their tiny fists waving at him like small accusatory flags. He scooped them both up, one in each arm, working entirely on instinct, and they quieted almost immediately, burrowing against the warmth of his coat, with the trusting desperation of creatures who needed heat more than they needed anything else. He looked around. No wagon, no horse, no supplies, no blankets, no indication that whoever had left this woman here had any intention of coming back for her. Only the carved posts, the ropes, and the vast, indifferent cold. The cabin was less than 2 miles east. The temperature was dropping. Jesse made the calculation quickly, practically, without sentiment. He could not carry all 3 safely on horseback, but he could carry the children against his chest and led the horse with one hand while supporting the woman across the saddle. He removed his coat. He wrapped the infants together inside it, using his belt to secure them against his chest, their small, warm weight pressing against him through the flannel of his shirt. Then he lifted the woman she did not wake and laid her across the saddle, positioning her so her weight was distributed and she would not fall. He kept one hand on her throughout the walk back, steadying her against the movement of the horse. The 2 miles felt like 10. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had risen fully over the mountains and turned the snow blinding white, and the wind had sharpened into something with intent. Jesse's hands were numb. His legs ached from walking through the frozen crust of snow that gave way unpredictably. The children against his chest had stopped crying and were simply breathing, and he checked them every few minutes to make sure that was still true. He kicked the cabin door open with one boot and carried them all inside. The fire had died overnight. The cabin was cold, but not outdoor cold different enough to matter. Jesse laid the woman on his bed, the only bed, and covered her with every blanket he owned, without pausing to consider the logistics of that. Then he turned to the infants. He found a wooden crate near the wall, lined it with the wool blanket he used for the horse in bad weather, and placed both children inside it near the hearth. They lay facing each other, their breathing synchronized in the way of people who have shared a space from before the beginning of everything. Only then did Jesse build the fire. He worked fast, feeding it past the point of warmth into the point of roaring, until the heat pressed against his face and he could feel his hands again. Then he went back to the woman. Her wrists were worse than he had understood in the low light of the boundary fence. The rope had not merely cut it, had bitten, working through skin and into the tissue below in the way that only happens when a person has pulled against a restraint for hours. He fetched water from the barrel, warmed it over the fire, and cleaned the wounds with the careful patience of a man who had once spent 2 days nursing a calf back from the edge of something final. He bandaged what he could. The rest he could only keep clean and hope. She did not wake that night, or the next. Jesse tended to the infants with a thoroughness that surprised him. He had no knowledge of children to speak of, had no particular frame of reference beyond the memory of watching cattle with new calves, but something in the smallness of them, the absolute dependency, the way they turned toward warmth and touch, with a certainty that expected no rejection, worked on him in ways he did not examine too closely. He warmed water and used a cloth to feed them what little he could manage. He held them when they cried. He spoke to them in the low, even voice he used with the livestock, not because he thought they understood, but because silence felt wrong. He did not sleep for 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, he was sitting in the chair by the fire when he heard the quality of her breathing change, not the shallow, uneven sound of a body enduring. Something slower, something more deliberate. He looked up. She was watching him. Her eyes clear now, the gray of them focused and present, moved around the cabin with the careful attention of a person taking inventory of a situation before committing to a response. She cataloged the ceiling, the walls, the fire, the crate where the infant slept, and finally, reluctantly, him. Jesse set down the mug he was holding. "You're awake," he said. "Yes." Her voice was barely there, scraped clean. "Where am I?" "My cabin, about 5 miles north of Garrison." She said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Wyoming." "Yes." A long exhale. Something moved through her expression that he could not fully read, relief maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a person who has been bracing for something terrible and has finally been permitted to stop. "How long?" "5 days." Her eyes moved to the crate. The infants were asleep, their small chests rising and falling in the slow rhythm of the deeply comfortable. Her expression changed entirely. It was the kind of change that happens when a person has been holding something at a distance for the sake of survival and is finally permitted to feel it. Love and pain arriving simultaneously, indistinguishable from each other. "They're alive," Jessie said. She pressed her lips together. A tear moved down the side of her face and she did not reach up to wipe it. "Healthy," he added, "hungry mostly, but alive." She closed her eyes. For a moment her whole body shook, not with cold, but with the release of something she had been holding at enormous effort for a very long time. Jessie poured coffee and brought it to her, helping her sit. She wrapped her hands around the mug and held it the way people hold things they cannot afford to lose. After a while, she said, "My name is Nora Caldwell." "Jesse Harlan." She looked at him over the rim of the mug with the gray eyes that saw more than they let on. "Why did you help me?" He thought about that. "Why wouldn't I? Most people wouldn't have." "I'm not most people." She studied him, the worn shirt, the calloused hands, the face that had not been asked to perform warmth for a long time, but still held it somewhere underneath the way coals hold heat even after the visible flame is gone. "No," she said very quietly. "I don't think you are." Her story came out over the following days in the way that water finds its way through cracked stone, not all at once, not in a rush, but steadily following the path of least resistance, filling the available space. She had been 16 years old when her parents arranged her marriage to Arthur Caldwell, second son of the Caldwell family of Garfield County. Her family had been farmers, honest people, hardworking people, people who had watched a string of bad seasons eat away at everything they had built, and found themselves finally with nothing left to offer their daughter, except the name of a man willing to take her. Arthur Caldwell was 26, serious, not unkind, but not warm. He provided a house meal's respectability. For 3 years, Nora had lived inside a marriage that functioned the way certain machines function reliably without joy, producing exactly what it was designed to produce and nothing more. She had tried. She had learned to read the silences in that house, to navigate around Arthur's moods and Roland's hostility and the cold disapproval of the Caldwell matriarch, who had never believed any woman born outside the family's social register was worthy of the name. She had kept the house and managed the accounts with the careful precision of someone who understood that her position was conditional on her usefulness. When she discovered she was pregnant, she had felt something she had not expected: hope. Not for herself exactly, for the possibility of something in that house that might grow toward her rather than away. The pregnancy had been difficult from the beginning. She was sick, constantly weakened, unable to perform the household duties that were expected of her. When the midwife confirmed twins in the 5th month, the temperature in the Caldwell house dropped several degrees. Roland, Arthur's older brother, the one who ran the family business, the one who sat at the head of the table, even when Arthur was present, had looked at her across the dinner table that evening with an expression she had since spent a great deal of time trying to understand. Not anger exactly, something more calculating. The look of a man who has just discovered a complication in a plan he had not previously shared with anyone. Arthur had said very little. In the 7th month, he had ridden into Garrison alone on a Tuesday. He told Roland he was going to the bank. He told Nora he would be back by evening. He was back by evening. He did not tell her where he had gone. 2 weeks later, Arthur Caldwell was dead, shot in the back during what was reported as a dispute over a card game in a saloon 3 towns over. The man who shot him was never found. Roland had ridden out to identify the body personally. He had returned to the house with an expression that Nora had analyzed in the sleepless nights since and could only describe as carefully arranged grief, as kind of grief that a man constructs because he knows what it should look like. She had gone into labor 3 days after the funeral. Roland and his 2 brothers had been there. The midwife, Eleanor Graft, had been brought in from Laramie. Nora had labored for 11 hours, the Caldwell men watching from the hallway with expressions of cold impatience, and she had delivered 2 daughters into the candlelit room. 2 living, healthy, screaming daughters. She had heard Roland's voice through the wall. She had not heard what he said, but she had heard the tone. 1 week later, in the dead of a January night, she had been pulled from the bed where she was nursing her daughters and dragged through the house in her indoor clothes and out into the frozen dark. Roland had given the orders. His brothers had carried them out. Eleanor Graft had been standing in the hallway with her bag already packed, and she had not moved, and she had not spoken, and she had not looked at Nora's face. They had tied her to the post at the property boundary with the deliberate knots of men who knew what they were doing. They had set the babies at her feet not out of mercy, but because taking the children would have required explaining where they were, and they had ridden back to the warm house and left her in the dark and the cold. She had screamed until she had nothing left. She had pulled against the ropes until the blood ran down her palms and dripped from her fingers into the snow. She had watched her daughters turn from pink to pale in the tearing cold and told herself to stay conscious, to stay present, to not surrender to the dark that pressed against the edges of her vision. She did not know how many hours passed. She only knew that at some point she stopped being able to feel her hands and then stopped being able to feel anything below her shoulders, and then the screaming became silence because there was nothing left to spend. Nora finished telling this while staring into the fire, her mug empty in her hands, her voice steady in the way of a person who has already survived the worst of something and is now simply reporting facts. Jesse had not spoken throughout. He sat in the chair across from her with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes on her face, and he listened completely, without distraction, without the impulse to interrupt or redirect or offer comfort before the full truth had been given room to exist. When she finished, the fire crackled, and the infants breathed softly in the crate, and outside the wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves. Jesse said, "They'll come back." "Yes. When they do, you won't be here alone." She looked at him. The gray eyes measured something. "You don't owe me anything, Jesse." "No," he said, "I don't." He stood and went to check the children, adjusting the blanket edge with one careful hand. The smaller one, the one with the darker hair that Nora had named Faith, had worked her hand free and was holding her own fist against her cheek, with the solemn concentration of a person solving a complex problem. He tucked the hand back under the blanket gently. "You need to tell me something," he said without turning around. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, "Arthur went to see a lawyer 2 weeks before he died." Jessie turned. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not the grief, not the exhaustion, not the careful, measured composure of the past days. Something else. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to be said. He wanted to change the inheritance arrangement. There was land on the eastern edge of the Caldwell property, about 40 acres, that his grandfather had separately deeded to the second son in the family line. Arthur wanted that land put in my name, and in the names of any children that we had. She paused. Roland knew Arthur had gone to see the lawyer. Arthur died 10 days later. Jesse said nothing. The lawyer drew up a document, Nora continued, a properly executed witness document. I don't know if Roland was able to suppress it through official channels, but I know he didn't get his hands on all copies. She reached down to the hem of her dress, the torn, stained dress she had arrived in, which Jesse had not replaced because he had nothing suitable and had not thought to ask, and which she had refused to discard despite the damage. She worked at a seam along the inside of the hem with her fingernails carefully until a small section of inner lining separated from the outer fabric. She reached inside. She withdrew a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases from being carried against a body for weeks, slightly darkened at one corner from proximity to the blood of the rope wounds. She held it out to Jesse. He crossed the room and took it. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was formal, legal, the kind of precise penmanship that men trained in documents used when they wanted what they wrote to hold in a court of law. The signature at the bottom was Arthur Caldwell's. The two witness signatures below it were notarized with the seal of the Garrison County Legal Registry. Jesse read it twice. He folded it carefully and held it in both hands for a moment, standing in the middle of the cabin, with the fire at his back and the sleeping children to his left, and this woman watching him with gray eyes that held, for the first time since he had cut her from that fence post, something that looked like possibility. "Does Roland know you have this?" he asked. "No, he searched my things the night before they took me, but he didn't search what I was wearing." Jesse looked down at the document in his hands. 40 acres of Caldwell land deeded to Nora and her children by a dead man who had, in the last weeks of his life, apparently decided to do one decent thing. And then he had died. And his brother had done everything in his power to ensure the consequence of that decision. These two women, these two children, this person sitting across from him, wrapped in borrowed blankets, did not survive to make it matter. Jesse set the document on the table between them. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them both back and sat down. "We'll need to keep this somewhere Roland can't reach," he said. Nora wrapped her hands around the mug. "It's been against my body for 3 weeks. I'd say it's reasonably secure." Something moved across Jesse's face that might, in a different man, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. He looked down at his coffee. "You have a name for the girls?" he asked. "Faith and Hope." He nodded slowly. "Good names." "I thought so." She looked toward the crate. Faith was still working on the problem of her own fist. Hope was watching the ceiling with the solemn attention she had been directing at everything around her since the moment she first opened her eyes. "They're going to be something," Nora said quietly. "I knew it before they were born. I know it now." "I believe you." She looked at him. "You don't know anything about them." "No, but I know their mother was tied to a post in the middle of January and still managed to keep a legal document warm through 3 weeks of winter." He held her gaze. "I think the girls come by it honestly." Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had softened and the late afternoon light was settling into the wrong blue shadows of a Wyoming winter evening. The fire had burned down to a steady, even heat. the kind of heat that asks nothing and simply gives. They'll come soon, she said. Roland doesn't leave things unresolved. I know. He has money. He has connections. He has people in the county who owe him. I know that too. And you're still not telling me to leave. Jesse looked at her across the space between them. This woman who had survived something that would have ended most people who had carried a legal document sewn into her dress through a near-fatal January night, who had woken in a stranger's cabin and told him the truth when she could have told him nothing, who was looking at him now with gray eyes that were frightened and clear-headed in equal measure. I stopped telling people what to do a long time ago, he said, but I'm not sending you anywhere. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, the small nod of a person who has made a decision and means to keep it. Faith made a sound from the crate, a small escalating sound that both of them recognized as the preamble to something considerably louder. Nora set down her coffee and rose carefully, still unsteady on her feet, but steadier than she had been yesterday, and crossed to the crate and lifted her daughter out. The baby settled immediately, turning her face into her mother's warmth, with the instinctive certainty of a creature who knew exactly where she belonged. Jesse watched this and said nothing. He looked at the document on the table between them. Then he looked out the window at the Caldwell land to the north, which was dark now against the winter sky, and at the fence line he could just barely see from where he sat, and at the post, the specific post where he had found them, where someone had taken the time to carve those 4 words into the wood with a steady hand and a cold intention. He had been riding the same fence lines for years. He knew every post, every wire, every tree that grew close enough to the boundary to complicate the work. He had never paid particular attention to where the Caldwell land began, and his own ended because it had never mattered. Now it mattered considerably. He reached out and picked up the document. He folded it carefully with the precision of a man handling something that needed to last and carried it to the small iron box he kept on the shelf above the fireplace. The box that held his parents' marriage record and the deed to his own land and the few papers that represented everything he had managed to hold on to. He placed the document inside. He closed the box. He did not lock it because there was no lock, because he had never before had anything in that box that someone else might want badly enough to come for it. He thought about that for a moment. Then he went to check the rifle. The thaw came and went 3 times in February, the way Wyoming winters often teased, offering a few days of softened sky and dripping eaves before pulling everything back under a fresh layer of white. Jesse used each brief window to ride the fence lines, check the livestock, and watch the northern horizon with the particular attention of a man who knows something is coming and cannot know exactly when. Inside the cabin, life reorganized itself around new arrangements. Nora healed with the quiet determination of someone who had decided that recovery was not optional. Within the first week, she was on her feet, moving carefully around the small space, cataloging its contents, with the methodical eye of a woman who had managed a household and understood that order was not a comfort, but a necessity. Within the second week, she had taken over the cooking, had found Jesse's small collection of tools, and mended a split in the leather harness he had been meaning to fix for a month, and had begun teaching herself the routine of the ranch by watching and asking precise, practical questions that Jesse found easier to answer than he expected. She did not ask for permission. She identified what needed doing and did it. Jesse watched this and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The cabin had been a functional space before. Now it was something else, not larger, not better equipped, but inhabited in a different way. The way a room feels different when a window is open that has been closed for a long time. The girls grew. Faith was louder, quicker to demand attention, her cries carrying the particular urgency of a person who considers delay unacceptable. Hope was quieter, watchful, her dark eyes tracking movement around the cabin with an intensity that seemed too settled for a face that young. Jesse found himself in the early mornings before the full work of the day began, holding one or the other of them near the east window while the light came up over the mountains, talking to them in the woods, even voice he used when the work was steady and the world was temporarily uncomplicated. He told them the names of things: the mountains to the east, the specific pine tree at the fence line that had survived 3 lightning strikes and was still standing, which he considered a personal accomplishment on the tree's part, the horse whose name was Gray and who had opinions about weather that were more reliable than any almanac Jesse had consulted. He did not examine why he was doing this. Examining it would have required him to name something he was not ready to name. Nora watched him from across the room on those mornings and kept her thoughts to herself, which was a quality Jesse had come to appreciate more than he could have anticipated. On the morning of the 19th of February, Jesse rode into Garrison for supplies. He did not want to go. He had been putting it off for 2 weeks, managing with what was in the larder, stretching the flour and the salt and the coffee past the point where stretching was comfortable. But there were things the cabin needed that the land could not provide, and staying away from town indefinitely was not a strategy. It was a delay, and delays had a way of compounding interest. He kept his head down and Garrison loaded his supplies with the efficiency of a man who wanted to be somewhere else and was almost to his horse when the shopkeeper called out from the doorway. "Harlan!" Jesse stopped. The man leaned against the door frame with his arms folded and the expression of someone carrying information he is deciding whether to share. "You ought to know," he said, keeping his voice below the wind. "Roland Caldwell has been in town twice in the past week, talking to people." Jesse waited. "Talking about you, mostly. Reminding people you have always kept to yourself, suggesting that a man who lives that far from his neighbors with a woman who isn't his wife and 2 children that aren't his might have reasons for that kind of privacy that aren't respectable." The shopkeeper paused. "He also mentioned something about a previous legal situation. Said you'd had trouble with the law before, that you weren't to be trusted around vulnerable people." Jesse's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "I'm not saying anyone believes him. I'm saying he's building something. The way a man lays fence posts before he strings the wire. One post at a time, and it doesn't look like much until you notice you're surrounded." Jesse loaded the last of the supplies onto the horse. "I appreciate you telling me. There's one more thing." The shopkeeper glanced toward the street, checking who might be watching. "Agnes Whitmore at the boarding house wants to speak with you. Said to stop by before you leave town. Said it was important." Jesse looked toward the boarding house across the street, a solid 2-story structure with a painted sign above the door and window boxes that would hold flowers in the spring. He had passed it 100 times and never had reason to enter. He tied the horse and went inside. Agnes Whitmore was a woman of 55 who had the bearing of someone accustomed to managing situations that arrived complicated and needed sorting. She ran the boarding house with the calm efficiency of long practice and knew more about the internal workings of Garfield County than any elected official because people talked in boarding houses in ways they did not talk in public. And Agnes had 40 years of accumulated knowledge and the good sense to know what to do with it. She brought Jesse to a small sitting room off the main hall, closed the door, and sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap. "I knew Nora before she married Arthur Caldwell," she said. "Not well. Her family were farming people kept to themselves. But I knew her father an honest man, a hard worker, the kind of man who made a bad decision under pressure and spent the rest of his life knowing it." She paused. Selling his daughter's future to the Caldwells to keep the farm was the bad decision. Jesse said nothing. "I know what the Caldwells are. I've watched that family for 30 years. Roland Caldwell is not a man who makes threats he doesn't intend to fulfill. He is methodical, patient, and entirely without conscience when it comes to protecting the family's interests." She looked at Jesse steadily. "He is going to move against you formally. He's already spoken to a circuit judge in Cody. The accusation will be kidnapping and unlawful detention. The argument will be that Nora is an unstable widow who was taken advantage of by a man with a troubled history." The word landed with weight. Kidnapping. In a territory where the law was still establishing its reach, a man's reputation could be destroyed by an accusation before the truth had time to organize itself. "He will also raise your history," Agnes continued, "the legal matter from years back. He has already located the records." Jesse looked at his hands. In the months after his parents died, there had been a dispute with a neighbor over a water rights boundary that had escalated beyond what either party intended. A man had ended up dead not by Jesse's hand, but at the property line, where the two of them had argued 3 days earlier. The circumstantial case against Jesse had been weak and the charges had been dropped, but the record existed. It had followed him like a shadow he had learned to stop trying to outrun. Roland Caldwell had apparently found it. "There is a lawyer in Cheyenne," Agnes said. "His name is Henry Pratt. He has handled cases against the Caldwells before, and he is not afraid of them, which is a rarer quality than it should be. She placed a card on the table between them. He is also the man Arthur Caldwell visited 2 weeks before he died. Jesse looked up. Agnes met his eyes. Henry Pratt drew up the document Arthur signed. He has his own copy properly registered with the Territorial Records Office, which Roland Caldwell has apparently been unable to suppress despite several attempts. She paused. Roland knows the document exists. What he does not know is whether Nora has a copy or whether anyone else is aware that she does. Jesse picked up the card. Tell Nora, Agnes said, that she is not as alone as Roland wants her to believe. The ride back to the cabin was the longest 2 hours Jesse had spent on a horse in recent memory. He pushed Gray harder than he usually did, the supplies rattling in their sacks, his mind running the information Agnes had given him against everything he knew about the situation, looking for the shape of what was coming. Roland was not simply trying to recover Nora. He was trying to neutralize her, to reduce her in the eyes of the law and the community. From a woman with a legitimate legal document and a credible accusation of attempted murder to a vulnerable, unstable person who needed to be managed rather than heard. It was a strategy of elegant cruelty. Make the victim unbelievable before she could speak. Make the man protecting her into the threat. Jesse recognized it with the cold clarity of someone who had been on the receiving end of a similar construction and had spent a long time understanding how it worked. He arrived at the cabin as the light was failing. Nora was at the window when he came through the door, Faith on her hip, and she read his face before he had fully removed his coat. Tell me, she said. He told her everything. She listened without interruption, her gray eyes steady, and her face doing the particular work of a person organizing information rather than simply receiving it. Only when he finished did she sit down, setting Faith carefully in the crate beside her sleeping sister. He's going to say I'm unstable, she said. Yes. He's going to say you took advantage of me. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. And he's going to use what happened to you before to make people believe that's the kind of man you are. Jesse sat down across from her. Nora, you need to know about that. I know about it already. He looked at her. Agnes stopped here while you were checking the southern fence line last week, Nora said. She told me about the water rights dispute and the man who died and the charges that were dropped. She held his gaze. I already told you I trust you. That information didn't change that. It confirmed that you've been living under a shadow that doesn't belong to you, and that Roland is the kind of man who knows how to weaponize other people's shadows. Jesse looked at her for a long moment. There's more, he said. He told her about Henry Pratt, the lawyer in Cheyenne, the registered copy of Arthur's document, the evidence that someone outside the Caldwell family's reach had been holding the proof of what Arthur intended. Something moved behind Nora's eyes. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, but the particular shift of a person discovering that the ground they are standing on is more solid than they believed. He has his own copy, she said, registered with the Territorial Records Office. She looked toward the iron box on the shelf above the fireplace. Then Roland can't suppress it. He can try, he has been trying, but Pratt is apparently not a man who responds well to pressure. Nora was silent for a full minute, her eyes on the fire. Then she said, when they come, and they will come soon, I need to be the one to speak. Jesse looked at her. Not because you can't, she said quickly, because I'm the one this is about. Because every time a man speaks on behalf of a woman in a situation like this, the story becomes about the man. And Roland has already decided what story he's telling about you. She looked at him with gray eyes that had moved well past fear into something more purposeful. The only story he can't control is the one that comes from my mouth. Jesse thought about this for a long moment. Then he nodded. 4 days later, Roland Caldwell appeared at the cabin door. He came alone this time, no brothers, no hired men. Just Roland in a good coat, carrying a leather satchel, his horse tied at the edge of the yard. Jesse watched him approach from the barn and came down slowly, not hurrying, not reaching for the rifle. There was something calculated about this visit that was different from what Jesse had been expecting, and he wanted to understand it before he responded to it. Roland stopped 10 feet from the porch. He looked at Jesse with the composed neutrality of a man accustomed to negotiations he controls in advance. I'd like to speak with Eliza, he said. He used the wrong name, deliberately, not Nora, but the name of some other woman, some simpler version of events that fit his framing better. Her name is Nora, Jesse said. Roland's expression did not change. I'd like to speak with my brother's widow. She'll speak for herself if she chooses. The cabin door opened. Nora appeared in the doorway. Hope on her hip, faith visible behind her in the crate. She looked at Roland with the gray eyes that had survived worse than this. Roland reached into his satchel and produced a document. He held it out toward her. I want you to understand that I hold no ill will toward you, he said. The events of January were unfortunate. You were in a state of distress. You made decisions that any person might make in similar circumstances. He paused. I've spoken with Dr. Vander in Garrison. He has prepared a statement attesting to the psychological effects of postpartum grief. It acknowledges that your perception of events may have been significantly altered by your condition. Nora looked at the document from the doorway. She did not take it. You've had a physician sign a document declaring me unstable, she said, without examining me. For your protection, Roland said, so that the court understands, so that the court dismisses anything I say. Her voice did not rise. That's what the document is for, not my protection, mine. Roland's composure held, but something shifted in his eyes. Nora, the children need stability. They need family around them. Whatever you believe about the circumstances of January, the fact remains that those girls carry the Caldwell name and the Caldwell family is prepared to provide for them properly. You left them in the snow, Nora said, wrapped in half a shawl, in January. Well, that's not... You carved words into the post you tied me to. Her voice was very quiet now and very clear. 4 words. I read them before I lost consciousness. You wanted me to read them. You wanted the last thing I understood to be that no one was coming. She held his gaze across the yard. I'm still here, Roland, and I still have Arthur's document. And you still forged his signature on a will 3 days after he died, which I suspect the Territorial Records Office will find very interesting. The silence that followed was absolute. Roland looked at her for a long moment. The composed neutrality had shifted into something harder and more honest. He put the forged medical document back into his satchel with careful, deliberate movements. You should think carefully, he said, about what comes next. I have thought carefully, Nora said. Since January, I've had time. Roland turned without another word and walked to his horse and rode north toward the Caldwell property without looking back. Jesse stood in the yard and watched him go. Then he climbed the porch steps and stood beside Nora. He'll come back with the law, she said. Yes. We need to contact Pratt. I'll ride to Garrison tomorrow and send a wire. She nodded, watching the empty trail where Roland had disappeared. He brought a forged medical document, she said. He's been planning this for weeks, every detail. I know. She looked at him. He's afraid of that paper in the iron box. He should be. Something settled in her expression. Not ease exactly. She was not a person who permitted herself ease prematurely, but a kind of readiness. The readiness of someone who has identified the shape of the thing coming and has decided to meet it standing up. We need to be ready, she said. We will be. 3 days later they came. Jesse saw them from the barn roof where he was replacing shingles that the last ice storm had loosened. 8 riders on the northern trail moving with the deliberate pace of people who are not in a hurry because they believe they have already won. He recognized Roland Caldwell's posture from a quarter-mile away, the rigid spine, the slightly elevated chin, the bearing of a man who has never had to approach anything without the expectation of being received on his own terms. Behind Roland rode 2 of his brothers. Behind them, 3 men in the worn practical clothing of hired labor. And at the front of the group, slightly to the right of Roland, 2 riders in the distinctive long coats of the Territorial Marshal's office. One of them was older, gray-bearded, with a face that had accumulated years of difficult decisions, the way stone accumulates weather. Marshal Clay Bennett. Jesse came down from the roof with controlled speed, not running but not walking either. He went to the cabin, pushed through the door, and found Nora sitting at the table, writing in the margin of one of his almanacs with a pencil stub. She had been doing this since she discovered his small shelf of books, making notes in margins, filling blank pages, working through something with the focused industry of a person who needed to think on paper. They're here, he said. 8 riders. Roland, his brother's hired men, and Marshal Bennett with a deputy. Nora set down the pencil. Take Faith and Hope into the back room, Jesse said. Bar the door from inside. Don't come out unless... No. She stood. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the particular quality of a word that does not expect to be argued with. She looked at him with clear gray eyes. I told you, I need to be the one to speak. Nora, Jessie. She picked up Faith, settled the baby against her shoulder, then reached into the crate for Hope. She held both daughters against her chest, one in each arm, with the practiced ease of the past weeks. She looked at him. Trust me. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside from the door. They went out onto the porch together. Jessie stood slightly to the left, the rifle held loose, invisible, but not raised present as a statement, not a threat. Nora stood at the center of the porch with both daughters against her back straight, her chin level. She wore one of the dresses Agnes had brought out 2 weeks earlier, pale gray with a dark collar, and her dark hair was pinned back simply. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived something that should have killed her and was standing in the winter light without apology. The riders pulled up 15 feet from the porch. Marshal Bennett dismounted first with the unhurried movements of a man who has delivered warrants for 30 years and considers the dramatics of the situation someone else's business. He had the kind of face that had stopped being capable of surprise a long time ago. Roland Caldwell remained on his horse. He looked at Nora with an expression of carefully arranged concern. Mrs. Caldwell, Roland said, I'm relieved to see you safe. Nora said nothing. Bennett stepped forward. My name is Marshal Clay Bennett, out of the Territorial Office. I have a warrant for the arrest of Jessie Harlan on charges of kidnapping and unlawful detention of a Mrs. Nora Caldwell and 2 minor children. He looked at Jessie without expression. I'll ask you to come peaceable, Mr. Harlan. The charges are false, Jessie said. That'll be for a judge to determine. Right now, they are false, Nora said. Bennett turned to look at her. My name is Nora Caldwell, she said. Her voice carried across the yard with complete clarity. I am standing here of my own free will, holding my daughters on the property of the man who saved all 3 of our lives. I was not kidnapped. I was not detained. I was found tied to a fence post on the Caldwell property line at the beginning of January, with these children at my feet in weather that would have killed all 3 of us before morning. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. Bennett's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. She's in a state of grief, Roland said from his horse. She's been through a terrible experience, and she doesn't fully understand. I understand everything. Nora's voice did not rise. It did not need to. I understand that my husband died 10 days after visiting a lawyer to change his will in my favor. I understand that the night I delivered your brother's daughters, you stood in the hallway of that house and made a decision. And I understand that the ropes you used to tie me to that post were secured with the kind of knots that don't happen by accident. She paused. I also understand that you came here 4 days ago with a document you claimed a doctor prepared for my protection. A document declaring me psychologically unfit, signed by a physician who has never examined me. She shifted Hope to her left arm. With her right hand, she reached into the neckline of her dress and withdrew a folded paper. She held it up. Roland Caldwell's face underwent a change that was not performance. The color moved out of it the way water moves out of a tilted glass, steadily, completely leaving something pale and rigid behind. This is a document executed by Arthur Caldwell in the office of Henry Pratt, registered attorney in Cheyenne, witnessed and notarized, deeding 40 acres of Caldwell land to me and to any children of our marriage. Her eyes moved from Bennett to Roland and back to Bennett. Arthur signing this 2 weeks before he died. Roland knew about it. Arthur died 10 days later. She looked at Bennett directly. Henry Pratt has a registered copy in Cheyenne. I have this copy. I have carried it against my body since the night your brother tied me to that post, because I knew it was the reason he wanted me dead. The yard was absolutely silent except for the wind. One of the deputies dismounted. He walked forward slowly, stopping at the porch steps, and looked up at Nora. Ma'am, he said quietly, may I see your wrists? Laura transferred both babies to one arm with the practiced balance of a woman who had been doing this for weeks. She extended her free arm and pushed back the sleeve. The scars were still visible, not raw anymore, but permanent, the kind of marks that settle into skin and stay. The patterned lines of rope, the deeper cuts where the hemp had worked through the surface. The deputy stared at them. Jesus, he said very quietly. Roland urged his horse forward. Those could be from anything. She's a troubled woman who has made serious accusations. Mr. Caldwell, Bennett's voice was quiet and final. I'll ask you to stop talking. Roland stopped talking. Bennett looked at Nora. Ma'am, are you here against your will? No? Has Mr. Harlan threatened you, harmed you, or coerced you in any way? No, he found me dying. He carried me and my daughters to his home in a blizzard. He cared for us for 5 days while I was unconscious. He has asked nothing of us except that we be safe. Bennett looked at Jesse. Jesse met his eyes and said nothing because Nora had said everything. Bennett turned to his deputy. Ride to the Caldwell property, northern fence line boundary post near the pine trees. Report what you find. He looked at Roland. Mr. Caldwell, you and your men will leave this property. You'll wait in garrison until I have conducted a proper investigation. Roland's jaw worked. This is outrageous. She is a widow under family protection and the law. The law is what I say it is in this county until a judge says different. Bennett's voice had not changed in volume, but it had acquired a quality that Jesse recognized as the sound of a man who has been in situations where things could go badly and has decided he will not allow that. And right now I have a woman with rope scars on her wrist telling me a story that is considerably more coherent than yours. So I'll ask you one more time to get off this property. The hired men looked at Roland. Roland looked at Bennett. Something passed between them, the specific calculation of a man measuring the distance between what he wants and what he can take. He pulled his reins and turned his horse. Before he rode, he looked at Nora, not at Jesse, at Nora. His eyes moved from her face to the document in her hand and back to her face, and the look he gave her was not the arranged concern of a grieving family member. You have made a serious mistake, he said. You made yours first, Nora said. Roland rode. Bennett stood in the yard for a moment. Then he turned back to Jesse and Nora. I can't make you any promises about where this goes. The document complicates things considerably. If it's legitimate, it is, Nora said. If it is, Bennett continued, then this situation has dimensions that go beyond anything I can resolve from the back of a horse. You'll need that lawyer in Cheyenne. He looked at Jesse. I'm not withdrawing the warrant yet, but I'm not executing it either, not until I've had a look at what's on that fence line and spoken to a judge myself. He paused. I'm doing this because her story is credible and her evidence is physical and real. That's all I'm asking, Jesse said. Bennett nodded. He looked at Nora one more time at the document in her hand, at the daughters in her arms. You did well, ma'am, keeping your head like that. I had a long time tied to a post to think about what I would say if I survived, Nora said. Bennett mounted his horse and rode toward town. Jesse and Nora stood on the porch until the sound of horses had fully disappeared in both directions. Then Nora sat down on the porch steps, still holding both daughters, and let out a long breath that had been held at considerable expense for the past 20 minutes. Jesse sat down beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The winter light was thin, and even over the snow and the pines along the northern boundary moved in the wind with their usual indifference to human affairs. He'll come back with more, Nora said. Roland doesn't stop. I know. She turned her head to look at him. You're not afraid. I didn't say that. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the mountains. Henry Pratt will need to know what happened here today, she said. I'll send a letter tomorrow. I want to write it. Jesse looked at her. It's my case, she said, simply, without challenge. Yes, he said, it is. She nodded. Hope, who had been watching the middle distance with her characteristic intense attention, turned her dark eyes toward Jesse and regarded him with the solemn focus she brought to everything. She does that to me too, Nora said. Looks at you like she already knows what you're going to say and is deciding whether it's worth her time. Jesse looked at the baby, who continued to regard him with complete seriousness. She's going to be trouble, he said. Both of them. Nora agreed. I'm counting on it. The evening came on fast and cold. They went inside. Jesse built the fire up while Nora settled the girls. He stood at the window for a long moment after looking north at the Caldwell land disappearing into the winter dark. Then he turned away from the window. He sat at the table across from Nora, who had already found paper and the pencil stub, and was composing in her head before she began writing, her eyes on the middle distance, with the focused expression he had come to recognize as her thinking face. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without interrupting. She looked up at him. Something passed between them, in that look, not said, not named, not requiring either word or ceremony. the acknowledgement of two people who have stood beside each other in a difficult place and found the other one still standing when it was over. Jesse picked up his coffee. "Write what you need to write," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked down at the paper and began. The letter reached Henry Pratt in Cheyenne on a Wednesday. By Friday, he was on a horse. He arrived at the cabin on a gray February afternoon with mud on his boots and a leather satchel worn soft at the corners from years of use, and he sat at Jesse's table and read Nora's letter a second time before he said anything. He was a compact man of 50 with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a career listening to what people said and, more importantly, to what they did not say. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away without permission. When he finished reading, he set the letter down and looked at Nora. "Arthur came to me on a Tuesday," he said. "He was nervous. Not the way men are nervous when they're doing something wrong. The way they are when they were doing something right for the first time and aren't certain they deserve the feeling." He paused. "He told me about the pregnancy, about the twins, about Roland's response when the midwife confirmed girls." He folded his hands on the table. "He said he wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, you and the children would not be left to Roland's decisions." Nora sat across from him with her hands flat on the table. "He knew something might happen to him. I think he suspected. He didn't say it directly. But a man who has lived under his brother's authority for 30 years develops a sense for the edges of what that authority will permit." Pratt looked at the iron box on the shelf. "The document you've been carrying, my registered copy, exists. The Territorial Records Office has it on file. Roland has made 2 formal attempts to have it classified as invalid on the grounds of Arthur's mental state at the time of signing. Both attempts failed because Arthur signed in my office in my presence, with 2 witnesses on a day when his capacity was entirely clear." He paused. "Roland knows he cannot make the document disappear through official channels, which is why he chose a different approach." Make me disappear instead," Nora said. "Yes." Jesse, who had been standing near the window, turned. "What's our position going into the trial?" Pratt looked at him. "Stronger than it was 2 weeks ago, thanks to what happened in this yard." He opened the satchel and began laying documents on the table. Marshal Bennett's deputy found the fence post. The ropes were still attached both ends. The blood in the grain of the wood was preserved by the cold. "Bennett filed his report 3 days ago. He has requested that the kidnapping warrant against you be formally withdrawn, and the circuit judge has agreed pending the outcome of a full hearing." He looked at Jesse. "You are no longer under arrest." Jesse said nothing. He had not spent much energy on the question of his own legal situation. It had seemed considerably less important than other concerns. "The hearing is set for the 14th of March in Millstone," Pratt continued. "The territorial prosecutor has agreed to take the criminal case. Roland and his brothers are facing charges of attempted murder, abandonment of minors, and forgery of legal documents." He looked at Nora. "You will need to testify." "I know," she said. "The defense will attempt to discredit you. They have hired a lawyer from Denver, a man named Crail, who is known for a particular technique of cross-examination designed to make witnesses appear either dishonest or unstable. He will be thorough and he will be personal." Pratt looked at her steadily. "I need you to understand what that means before you agree to do it." "I understand what it means," Nora said. "I've been understanding what men like Roland do to women like me for most of my life. It means they'll try to make me small enough that no one takes me seriously. It means they'll suggest I'm confused or grieving or not capable of knowing my own experience." She paused. "They can try. I've been smaller than this before. I survived it." Pratt looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the particular respect of a man who has heard a great many things in his professional life and recognizes when someone has said something that is simply and completely true. Before Pratt left that evening, he mentioned one more thing in the way that lawyers sometimes mention the most important things quietly, almost in passing. "There is also the matter of the land," he said. 40 acres legally deeded, properly registered. If the criminal case is resolved in the way the evidence suggests it should be, the land question becomes straightforward. The document stands. The deed is valid." He looked at Nora. "Arthur left you more than safety, Mrs. Caldwell. He left you independence." After Pratt rode out, Jesse and Nora sat by the fire in the particular quiet of 2 people processing large things in each other's company. The girls were asleep. The fire was steady. The night outside was clear and cold, and entirely indifferent to the machinery of human justice turning slowly in the distance. Jesse said, "There's something I should have said before now." Nora looked at him. "When I found you at that fence post," he said, keeping his eyes on the fire, "I told myself I was helping because it was the right thing to do. Because leaving would have made me a certain kind of man, and I didn't want to be that kind." He paused. That was true, but it wasn't all of it. Nora waited. "Somewhere in the past 6 weeks," he said, "this stopped being about doing the right thing." He looked at her. "It started being about not wanting to imagine the alternative, not wanting to think about what this cabin would feel like if you and the girls weren't in it." He said it directly without embellishment, the way a man states a fact he has verified and is confident in. "I don't have a way to make that more eloquent, but I wanted you to know it was true." Nora was quiet for a long time. The fire shifted. Hope made a small sound in her sleep and settled again. When Arthur died, Nora said, "I told myself I was done with trust. Not just trust in men, or trust in marriage, or trust in the kind of arrangements that families make when they need something from each other. Trust in general, in the idea that any person could be relied upon to stay when staying was difficult." She looked at her hands. "And then you carried me 2 miles through a blizzard with my daughters inside your coat." She paused. "It's hard to argue with evidence like that." Jessie looked at her. "I'm not done with trust," she said. "I found out I'm not done with it. I think that's worth saying." Jessie reached across the table and took her hand. He held it carefully without pressure, allowing it to simply be present in his grip. She turned her palm up and held on. They were married on the 5th of March, 9 days before the trial. Agnes Whitmore opened her parlor for the occasion, clearing the regular furniture to the walls and placing 2 chairs at the center of the room that she had covered with the good cloth she saved for occasions that warranted it. She had also, in the quiet industry of the previous 2 weeks, located a dress of pale blue wool with a dark collar that fit Nora well enough to deserve the word, and she presented it on the morning of the ceremony with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who considers the practical expression of care more useful than the sentimental kind. Jesse wore his best shirt clean and pressed for only the 3rd time in recent memory. Henry Pratt was there, and Marshall Bennett, and Agnes herself. Faith and Hope attended in the way of infants at formal occasions passed between available arms with the democratic ease of people who have not yet developed a preference for ceremony. When the minister asked if anyone objected, Hope produced a sound of such emphatic and resonant finality that the entire room held still for one suspended moment before dissolving into laughter. The tension of the previous weeks, the weight of what was coming in 9 days lifted for a moment entirely, and the room was simply a room full of people laughing at a baby's impeccable timing. Jesse's hand shook when he placed his mother's ring on Nora's finger. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth from years on his mother's hand, one of the few things salvaged from the fire that had taken everything else. He had kept it in the iron box beside the property deed and the records that represented his survival. He had not known when he kept it, what he was keeping it for. He understood now. Nora looked down at it on her hand and then looked up at him with gray eyes that held the whole of what she was feeling without attempting to contain or qualify it. "I love you," Jesse said. The words came out rougher than he intended, scraped from a place that had not sent anything up in a very long time. "I should have said it before now. I love you." Nora's eyes filled. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting to see if you'd get there on your own." He kissed her while Faith observed from Agnes's arm with the alert expression of a person following a development that she had predicted and was now seeing confirmed. Hope had fallen asleep against Pratt's shoulder and missed the moment entirely, which everyone agreed suited her established character. Agnes, when she recovered her composure, said, "You are a family now, legal binding and entirely beyond Roland Caldwell's reach." Pratt, tucking the marriage certificate into his satchel, said, "I'll have this registered in Cheyenne by end of week. By the time we walk into that courtroom, every document is in order." They rode back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the sky above the mountains turning rose and amber, girls bundled between them in the wagon bed. Jessie kept stealing glances at Nora at the ring on her hand, at the expression on her face that was the particular expression of a person who has stopped waiting for the good thing to be taken away and has begun simply allowing it to be real. She caught him looking. "What?" she said. Nothing, he said. Just looking. She leaned her head against his shoulder for the rest of the ride, and he kept his eyes on the trail ahead, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The morning of the 14th of March arrived cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that offers no atmospheric sympathy for human proceedings and simply presents itself as light and air in the business of a new day. Jesse and Nora rode into Millstone together, leaving Faith and Hope in Agnes's care, and tied the horse outside the courthouse before the building had fully filled. It filled quickly. The courtroom in Millstone was not large, but it had the particular density that gathered around events the community understood to matter. Ranchers and their wives, townspeople, merchants, and working men occupied every bench. People stood along the walls. The air had the quality of a room where everyone is watching, and most of them have already decided what they think, which meant that the proceeding would need to earn its outcome from the evidence rather than from atmosphere. Roland and his two brothers, William and Seth, sat at the defense table with their lawyer from Denver, a man named Crail, who had the polished, slightly predatory bearing of someone who charged very high fees and considered that a reliable indicator of his competence. Roland wore a dark suit that communicated wealth without ostentation. He sat with the composed stillness of a man who has faced difficult situations before and knows that composure itself is a form of argument. He did not look at Nora when she entered. The territorial prosecutor was a young man named Samuel Garrett, serious and prepared, who had spent the previous week in Millstone reviewing everything Pratt had sent him. He opened the case with a methodical clarity, not dramatic, not performative, simply organized. He laid the evidence in sequence the way a man builds a fence, each post set before the wire is strung, each piece carrying weight and supporting what came after. The fence post, the ropes, the blood preserved in the grain of the wood, the carved words, "Women die here alone," documented in Bennett's report and read aloud to the courtroom in Bennett's flat, factual voice, which made them more devastating than any dramatic rendering could have achieved. The scars on Nora's wrists, which Bennett had formally documented, and which Garrett described with plain language that required no embellishment, to be devastating. Arthur's document, Pratt's registered copy, the timeline of Arthur's visit to the legal office, his death 10 days later, and Roland's subsequent attempts to have the document invalidated. The forged second will sign it according to the death records that Garrett placed before the court 3 days after the date Arthur Caldwell had died. This piece of evidence produced a sound in the courtroom that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something between the two, the sound of a room full of people revising their understanding of what they were witnessing. And the forged medical document, the declaration of Nora's psychological instability, signed by a physician who had never examined her, which Garrett produced with the careful deliberateness of a man saving a particular tool for the moment it would be most useful. He read the doctor's name aloud. He noted the date. He then produced the physician's own patient registry, obtained with Bennett's assistance, which showed no record of any examination of Nora Caldwell on any date. The doctor, it emerged, had been paid $200 for his signature. Crail objected repeatedly through the morning session, each time with a smoothness that communicated confidence. He was building toward Nora. His strategy was becoming clear. He would accept that something unfortunate had happened, would not deny the fence post or the ropes or the cold, but would reframe them. A woman in grief-induced confusion. A memory shaped by trauma into something that felt like accusation, but was in fact the fragmented reconstruction of a mind under enormous stress. He would be sympathetic. That was the cruelest part. Nora was called to the witness stand after the midday recess. She walked to the stand with the even measured pace she brought to everything, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. She wore the blue dress from the wedding, her hair pinned back simply. She looked out at the courtroom with gray eyes that were calm and present in the specific way of a person who has had a long time to prepare for this exact moment. Garrett took her through the account, carefully establishing each element in sequence, allowing her to speak without interruption. She told it the way she had told Jesse that first week in the cabin, in pieces that connected, that built, that held together under their own logic. The marriage, the pregnancy, the family's response to twins, to daughters. Arthur's visit to Pratt, Arthur's death, the forged medical document Roland had brought to Jesse's cabin. The night Roland came, she spoke without drama. This was its own form of power. A woman performing distress is easy to discount. A woman stating facts in a level voice while describing something monstrous requires a different kind of effort to dismiss. When Garrett finished, Crail rose. He was pleasant about it, almost kind. He expressed his sympathies for her loss, for everything she had endured, for the difficulty of her situation. He asked his questions with the careful tone of a man who regrets the necessity but is obliged by professional duty to pursue the truth. He suggested gently that the events of that January night were difficult to remember clearly. "I remember everything," Nora said. He suggested carefully that grief and the physical and emotional demands of new motherhood could affect perception. "My perception is intact," Nora said. "I was tied to a post for several hours. There wasn't much to perceive, except cold and rope, and the sound of my daughters crying. Those things don't require perception. They simply were." He suggested that perhaps her understanding of Roland's motives was colored by her relationship with the Caldwell family. "My understanding of Roland's motives is based on what Roland did," Nora said. "He tied me to a post. He left my daughters in the snow. He signed a will with a dead man's name 3 days after the death was recorded. He paid a physician to declare me incompetent without examining me." She looked at Crail directly. "Those are not perceptions. They are facts. The court has the documents." Crail shifted. He moved to his next approach, Jesse's history, the suggestion that Nora had been influenced and manipulated by a man with a troubled past. "Jesse Harlan," Nora said before Crail had fully framed the question, "found me unconscious in the snow, with my daughters freezing at my feet, and carried us 2 miles through a blizzard to safety. He did this alone in the dark in January for people he had never met." She paused. "Whatever was in his past, that is what he did that morning. And that is what I know about him." Crail tried twice more. Each time Nora answered him with the same quality of voice, not loud, not combative, simply precise. She gave him facts. She declined to give him the uncertainty or the distress that his strategy required. By the time he sat down, he had the expression of a man who had entered a room expecting one kind of furniture and found everything nailed to the floor. Pratt testified about the document, the registration, the timeline meticulous and unshakable. Bennett testified about the fence post, the ropes, the carved words, the physical evidence his deputy had documented. Facts stated without emotion tend to sit heavier in a room than facts that arrive wrapped in feeling. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman entered. She was somewhere past 60 with the deliberate walk of someone managing pain that she has decided not to allow to stop her. She carried a small cloth bag in one hand. In the other hand, she carried a sealed envelope. She moved through the courtroom to the front, where she stopped and looked at the judge with the direct gaze of a person who has something to say and intends to say it. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Eleanor Graft. I was the midwife present at the birth of Faith and Hope Caldwell. I was asked to come to Millstone last week to speak in support of the Caldwell family's account of events." She set the envelope on the edge of the judge's bench. "This is the payment I was given for that testimony." She stepped back. "I am returning it because I cannot say what they have asked me to say." The courtroom produced the sound it had been holding since morning, a collective exhaling, a shift, the release of something that had been under pressure. Crail was on his feet, immediately objecting on grounds of procedural irregularity, relevance, and several other things that the judge acknowledged with a patience that suggested he had made up his mind about how he was going to handle this. "I'll hear the witness," the judge said. Eleanor Graff took the stand. She had the stillness of a woman who has done something that cost her and is not going to waste it. She described the night of the birth with the clinical precision of a professional who had attended hundreds of deliveries. The labor, the delivery, the health of the children. The men in the hallway, Roland's voice after the birth when it was confirmed that both children were girls. She described the week that followed, Nora confined to bed recovering, the atmosphere in the house. The way Roland moved through it with a new quality, not grief for his brother, not concern for the widow and her newborns, but the careful, purposeful energy of a man working through a sequence of decisions. She described the night they took Nora from the house. "I was told to pack my bag," she said. "I was told to be ready to leave at midnight. I was told that Mrs. Caldwell had recovered sufficiently and my services were no longer required." She paused. "I was in the hallway when they brought her through. She was not walking of her own will. She asked them to let her take the children herself. Roland told her the children would be brought out separately. Eleanor Graff looked at her hands for a moment. They were, in the arms of Seth Caldwell, who set them on the ground before he tied the last knot on the ropes. The courtroom was completely silent. I was paid $200, Eleanor Graff said, to return to Laramie and remember nothing. I have deposited that money with the clerk of this court, and I would like it noted in the record that it is not mine. She looked at the judge. I have been a midwife for 30 years. I have brought a great many lives into the world. I will not be the person who helped end 3 of them by saying nothing. Crail's cross-examination was perfunctory. He had nothing to work with. The physical evidence was documented. Pratt's testimony was iron. Bennett's report was official. The forged medical document had been exposed, and now an independent eyewitness had placed herself on the stand and returned the money she had been paid for silence. He sat down before he was finished. Then the back door of the courtroom opened again. This time it was Hank Morrow, the rancher from 5 miles east, a broad-shouldered man with the unhurried movements of someone who works with his hands and trusts them. He was not alone. Beside him, wrists bound with Hank's own rope, was a man that neither Jesse nor Nora had seen before, younger, roughly dressed, with the particular expression of someone who has been caught in the middle of something he was paid to do and is calculating the cost of what comes next. Hank walked the man to the front of the courtroom, stopped before the judge's bench, and removed his hat. Your Honor, he said, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Hank Morrow. I ranch 5 miles east of Jesse Harlan's property. He looked at the bound man beside him, then back at the judge. This morning, while this proceeding was underway, I was riding the fence line between my property and Harlan's when I found this man attempting to set fire to Harlan's barn. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He was carrying this on him. It's a note with Harlan's property described and the words, "Make it look like an accident." It is signed with the initial R. He set the paper on the bench beside Eleanor Graff's envelope. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of people waiting for something, the silence of people who have just watched the last door close. Roland Caldwell sat at the defense table with his hands on the wood in front of him and his face arranged in the composure of a man who has decided that composure is all he has left. His brother sat beside him, and whatever calculations they had been running since the morning had apparently arrived at the same conclusion because neither of them moved or spoke. Crail leaned toward Roland and said something quietly. Roland said nothing. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Jesse and Nora waited in a small anteroom off the main hall. The door closed, the sounds of the courthouse reduced to the occasional footstep and the distant, low sound of the building settling in the cold. They sat side by side, not speaking much. Nora's hand in Jesse's, with the steady grip of people who have decided to weather something together. At one point, Nora said, "Whatever they decide, they'll decide right," Jesse said. She was quiet for a moment. "You can't know that." Eleanor Graff walked in and put $200 on the judge's bench. Hank Morrow walked in with a man tied to his own rope and a note signed with Roland's initial. He looked at her. "I think we're going to be all right." She turned her face toward him. He could see the exhaustion in it, not the exhaustion of defeat, but the exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and can sense for the first time the possibility of setting it down. "When this is over," she said, "I want to plant a garden." Jesse looked at her. "A real one, with vegetables and flowers both. Something that takes time and care and grows because you tend it." She paused. "I've been living inside other people's structures my whole life. First my parents' farm, then the Caldwell house, then surviving. I want to make something that's mine, that's ours." She looked at him. "I want faith and hope to grow up knowing what it looks like when something is tended with care and allowed to be what it is." Jesse thought about the south-facing slope below the cabin where the soil was deep and the drainage was good, and he had never done anything with it except walk past it twice a day. "I know a good spot," he said. The jury foreman was a weathered rancher in his 60s who had the look of a man who had seen enough of the world to have developed opinions about it that he trusted. He stood and read the verdict in the flat, practical voice of someone reporting a thing that had been thoroughly considered and was now simply fact. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of abandonment of minors, guilty. On the charge of forgery of legal documents, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice based on the morning's additional evidence, guilty. Roland Caldwell received 10 years in the territorial prison. William and Seth received 8 each. The judge looked at all three of them with the expression of a man who has arrived at an opinion about the kind of people they were and is not going to waste ceremony on it. The claims of this family, the judge said, to guardianship over Nora Caldwell, now Nora Harlan, and her children are hereby permanently dissolved by this court. Any future attempt to assert such claims will be treated as contempt. He looked at Roland. Take them out. The marshals moved forward. Roland was led past the gallery with his hands in irons, past the rows of people who had filled the courtroom, to watch past Hank Morrow standing near the back wall with his hat in his hands, past Agnes Whitmore, who had arrived at some point during the afternoon and was standing near the door with her arms folded, and the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something and is now watching it arrive. He passed within 10 feet of where Nora sat. He did not look at her. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon light was doing what Wyoming light does in March, coming in low and horizontal and golden, making everything it touched look considered. Agnes found them on the steps and embraced Nora without preamble, and Nora held on for a long time. Hank Morrow shook Jesse's hand with both of his. Figured it was time I stopped being a poor neighbor, he said. You stopped being a poor neighbor this morning, Jesse said. Pratt appeared with his satchel and shook both their hands. The land deed will be formalized within the month. 40 acres free and clear in Nora Harlan's name. Arthur's document stands. He looked at Nora. He did one right thing at the end. It held. Nora nodded. They rode home in the last of the day's light, the two of them side by side on the trail they had both come to know, the mountains going dark and enormous to the east, the first stars becoming visible in the pale sky above the western ridge. Agnes had brought faith and hope to the cabin that afternoon, and when Nora came through the door, both girls were awake and vocal about the fact. Nora gathered them both against her, standing in the center of the cabin, and held them with her eyes closed for a long moment, while they made the sounds that infants make when they are exactly where they want to be. Jesse stood in the doorway and watched this. He thought about that door opening onto silence for so many years. He thought about the specific quality of a space that has been empty for so long that emptiness becomes the expected condition. The way cold becomes not a temperature, but a baseline, the default against which everything else is measured. He thought about a morning in January, frost on the ground, the sound of something that didn't belong to the landscape of his ordinary days, and the decision to follow it. He crossed the room and stood behind Nora and put his arms around all three of them. Faith immediately grabbed his thumb with the grip of a person who has decided this is hers and is not negotiating. Hope looked up at him from the angle of his wife's shoulder with those dark, assessing eyes. We're all right, Nora said, quietly into the room, into the warmth of it. Yes, Jesse said. He meant it completely, without reservation, having checked it thoroughly and found it true. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became something it had not been before. Not larger, not better equipped. The barn still leaned slightly west. The cabin still leaked. When the rain came from the wrong angle, the north fence line still required twice yearly attention. But the work of it now had a different quality, a different distribution of effort, a different reason. Hank Morrow arrived the following Saturday with his two sons and repaired the barn lean in a single afternoon. Jesse worked alongside them without much conversation, which Hank appeared to understand and find acceptable. When they were done, Hank's wife Martha sent a pot of stew home with them that fed the cabin for 3 days. More people came. Not many and not all at once, but steadily, in the way that good things accumulate when they are no longer being actively prevented. A woman from town brought cloth for the girls. The minister stopped by to offer his belated congratulations on the marriage. The shopkeeper in Garrison began saving the good coffee behind the counter. Nora started teaching Faith and Hope their letters before they were old enough to need them, because she believed that a person could not start too early with the things that would protect them. She taught herself what she needed to teach reading by firelight after the girls were asleep, preparing the lessons in the margin of the almanac that had become her working notebook. Jesse dug the south-facing slope below the cabin in the first week of April, turning the soil over with methodical patience, working it until it was ready. He built the fence to keep the wildlife outposts, set deep wire strung tight. He was particular about the posts. Nora planted the garden on a Saturday morning with the girls in a blanket on the ground nearby, watching with the attentive expressions they brought to everything. She put in vegetables in the back rows and flowers along the front because she had said she wanted both, and she meant it. Jesse handed her what she needed when she needed it, standing to the side in his role as the person who was not the one doing this, but was unambiguously present for it. When she finished, she stood and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at what she had made, which was at the moment simply turned earth with small markers at each row, nothing yet visible, nothing yet realized. "It'll come up," Jessie said. "I know," she said. "I know it will." Summer arrived and the garden grew and the land produced what land produces when a person attends to it with intention. The 40 acres to the north, Nora's acres, deeded and clear, sat under the same sky as Jesse's land, and they began in small ways to talk about what might be made of it, what kind of future it represented, what it meant to own ground that no one could take. In the late days of that summer, when the cabin was full and the land was worked, and the girls had developed into small people of distinct and occasionally inconvenient personality, Faith, already climbing things she had been expressly prohibited from climbing. Hope, reading with the focused intensity of someone who has found her life's primary occupation. Nora stood at the kitchen table with her hands resting on the wood and looked at Jesse across the space between them. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "Luke, I think," she said, "if it's a boy." Jesse set down the harness he had been working on. He crossed to her. He put both hands on the sides of her face and looked at her with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I've been certain about 2 children before," she said. "I know how this feels." He kissed her forehead, held her there for a long moment with his hands gentle against her face. Outside through the cabin walls, he could hear Faith making the particular sounds she made when she was attempting something she had been expressly prohibited from attempting. He could hear Hope's lower voice, patient and precise, explaining to her sister why it was a bad idea which would have no effect whatsoever. He could hear the wind in the pines. He could hear the land. He had spent so many years listening to this landscape in the silence of a man with nothing else to listen to, and it had always sounded to him like endurance, the sound of things simply continuing, persisting, holding on through the cold and the dark and the long seasons of nothing in particular. It did not sound like that now. Now it sounded like something else, something that took him a moment to find the word for because the word was not one he had had occasion to use in a long time. Home. He pulled Nora gently close. She came without resistance, her forehead against his chest, her hands finding their familiar place at his sides. Through the window, the Wyoming sky was doing what it did in September, going enormous and violet and full of stars, the kind of sky that makes a man feel small and fortunate in equal measure. Somewhere out there, 40 acres of Caldwell land sat under that same sky, deeded and free and waiting to be made into something. Somewhere out there, 3 men sat in territorial prison cells, and the machinery of their cruelty had run down to nothing. And here in a cabin that leaked when the rain came from the wrong direction, with a barn that no longer leaned, and a fence line that needed checking twice a year, with 2 daughters making noise in the back room, and a 3rd child becoming real in the world. Jesse Harlan held his wife in the firelight and understood, with the certainty of a man who has earned his understanding the hard way, that the long years of silence had not been punishment or waste. They had been waiting. Every empty evening, every quiet morning, every day of work done for no one but himself, all of it had been the before of this. The necessary accumulation of solitude that made the presence of these people in his life something he could fully recognize and hold and refuse to take for granted. He had ridden a fence line on a January morning and heard something that didn't belong. He had stopped. That was all. That was the whole of it. He had stopped and listened and followed the sound, and everything had followed from that. Luke was born on a Tuesday in early March, 11 months after the trial, arriving fast and loud into Jesse's hands, the way the most important things in his life had arrived without warning, without ceremony, and with complete disregard for his preparedness. He weighed more than the girls had, which Jesse noted, and then immediately forgave. Nora held him against her chest and looked up at Jesse with gray eyes that held the particular expression of a woman who has just done something remarkable and is not entirely surprised by that fact. "There he is," she said. Jesse looked at his son, and he was his son, no qualification needed, no asterisk required, and felt something move through him that he did not have language for and did not attempt to name. It was enough to feel it. It was more than enough. Faith pressed close, immediately needing to touch, to verify, to establish her relationship to this new development with characteristic directness. Hope stood at a slight distance and assessed the new arrival with careful deliberation, before concluding apparently that he would do. Jesse carried Luke to the window while Nora rested and stood there in the cold March light with his son against his chest and looked out at the land that had once been only his endurance and was now his family's future. 10 years later, Jesse and Nora stood on the porch in the September evening, watching the mountains go dark against the sky that was doing its September extravagance, going enormous, in amber and then violet, and then the deep clear black of a Wyoming night with stars from one horizon to the other. Faith was 15, tall and fearless, already testing every boundary Jesse set, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who considers rules a starting point for negotiation rather than a final word. Hope was 15 too, reading on the top porch rail with the focused absorption of a person who has found her life's primary occupation and sees no compelling reason to be interrupted by anything as transitory as a sunset. Luke was 9, somewhere in the barn, doing something he had not asked permission to do, the evidence of which would likely present itself at dinner. The garden was full. It always was by September. Nora had expanded it twice since that first planting, adding rows each spring, learning what the soil preferred, and working with it rather than against it. It produced more than they needed, and she gave the surplus to Martha Morrow and to the family that had settled 3 miles east the previous year. The 40 acres were no longer just land. There was a small herd grazing on the eastern section and plans drawn on the back of an almanac page for a proper barn the following spring. Nora had also in the past year begun teaching 2 afternoons a week in Garrison, traveling there on the horse she had named Arthur, in a spirit of complicated generosity that Jesse had found more eloquent than anything he could have said about forgiveness. On da kuchung toy, Nora said. She still said it sometimes. Not from obligation, not from sentiment, but from the specific need a person has to say true things out loud occasionally so they don't erode from being only thought. Jesse looked out at the north fence line, straight and true, in the fading light. The post where he had found her was still there. He had replaced the wood twice but kept the location, and sometimes in the early mornings, he rode past it the way a person returns to a place that altered everything, not to dwell but simply to remember that it was real. "You saved yourself," he said. "I cut the rope. That was all I did." "You stopped," she said. "You heard something, and you stopped when most men would have kept riding." He considered this. Any man worth a damn would have stopped. "Any man worth a damn did," she said. "You." He looked at her. She was looking at the mountains the way she always did in the evenings, with a quality of attention that was not wistfulness, but something more active, more present, as if she was still learning the landscape, still finding new things in it, still in the process of claiming it as hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He let it rest there the way he let things rest that had found their right place and did not need moving. Inside the cabin, something crashed. Hope's voice floated out through the window, patient and precise, carrying the tone of a person who predicted this outcome some time ago. "I told him the top shelf wasn't stable." Luke's voice followed, defensive and slightly muffled, suggesting he was already in the process of cleaning up whatever he had knocked over. "I almost had it." Faith's laughter came after that, loud and unrestrained, the laughter of someone who finds other people's minor disasters genuinely delightful. Nora laughed too against Jesse's shoulder, a sound that had been filling the cabin and the yard and the quiet Wyoming evenings for 10 years now, and that still struck him at unguarded moments as something he had not earned and was grateful for anyway. He tightened his arm around her. He thought about the garden putting itself to bed for the winter beneath the surface of the turned earth. He thought about what Nora had said when she planted the first seed, standing in the early April light, with soil on her hands and the girls watching from their blanket. "I know it will come up," she had known. She had carried that knowledge through everything, through the post and the ropes and the cold and the courtroom and the long, uncertain months, the same way she had carried Arthur's document through the January dark, close to her body, protected, certain of its value even when the world was doing its best to tell her she was worth nothing. He had spent his life learning to hold on. She had spent hers learning to trust that what she held had value. Between them, they had built something that neither could have built alone. Jesse pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Inside, the noise was escalating pleasantly in the way of a household that has too many people in it and not enough room, which is the best kind of problem a house can have. He straightened. I'd better go see about that shelf, he said. Nora smiled without lifting her head from his shoulder. Take your time, she said. It's already fallen. He stood there another moment in the cool September dark, with the stars coming out one by one above the mountains and his wife warm against his side, and the voices of his children carrying through the cabin walls with the easy volume of people who have never been told to make themselves smaller. Then he went inside. The door closed behind him with a soft, certain click, the sound of a man stepping into the life he had chosen. The life that had chosen him back, the life that had started with a frozen cry on a January wind and a decision to stop and follow the sound. He had stopped. Everything had followed from that. And here in the warm, imperfect fullness of it, with Faith laughing and Hope explaining and Luke defending his structural reasoning and Nora's quiet presence at the center of everything, holding it all together the way she had always held things together with clarity and purpose and a gray-eyed certainty that what was worth keeping was worth fighting for. Jesse Harlan understood that this was not luck. This was what happened when a person chose to stop, when a person chose to cut the rope, when a person chose every single day to stay. He crossed to the shelf. He went to his family.